The courtroom is full when Judge Preston Harland points toward the gallery and says the words that will follow him for the rest of his career. The maid. Stand up. Every head turns. In the third row sits an older black woman in a gray maintenance uniform, a worn leather folder resting on her knees. She rises slowly, without hurry, without apology. This is not a break room, Harland says. Cleaning staff do not interrupt a legal proceeding. I haven't interrupted anyone, Your Honor, she says. You're just a maid, he says. Know your place. Bailiff, remove her. She lifts the folder slightly, not as a threat, just as a fact placed on the table. You may want to look at what's inside this before you do that. Harland almost laughs. I don't take instructions from janitors. That is the moment the courtroom doors open. 3 attorneys walk in behind a man in a building operations blazer, carrying a leather case, a stack of bound documents, and a laptop bag with an evidence label taped to the side. The bailiff, who 20 minutes earlier had waved this same woman through to a public seat without much thought, now watches the procession with visible confusion. One of the attorneys crosses the floor and stops beside the woman in the gray uniform. Mrs. Whitaker, he says, we brought the deed and the building records you requested. The name lands on the room like a dropped stack of files. Her name is Grace Whitaker. She owns the 23-story building they are all standing inside of, the building that houses this very courtroom. But the deed in that stack of paper is not the most dangerous thing that just walked through the door. Buried inside the same folder is a set of access logs and a recording that will tie Judge Harland's own courtroom secretary to the property management company currently trying to throw a mother and her 8-year-old son out of their home. 5 hours earlier, none of this had happened yet. Grace Whitaker woke at 5:40 in a modest brick house on Atlanta's east side, the kind of house you could drive past 100 times without noticing. A framed photograph sat crooked on the kitchen counter, the way it always sat because she never bothered to straighten it. A younger Grace and her husband Daniel, in matching gray uniforms outside the first office building they had ever cleaned together. Daniel had died 4 years earlier. He'd spent his working life fixing boilers and learning every pipe and breaker panel in every building they touched, while Grace scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans after midnight, raising their son on whatever hours were left over. They kept cash in envelopes labeled by purpose, taped inside a kitchen drawer, because neither of them had trusted a bank that didn't know their names. Their first property was a half-collapsed strip of retail units nobody else wanted. Daniel rewired it himself over 6 weekends. Grace stripped decades of grime off the floors on her hands and knees, the same way she'd learned to clean office towers after midnight. Daniel used to say that a building's only real job was to protect the people who walked into it, and if it failed at that, it didn't matter how much rent it collected. That sentence had outlived him. It was carved, in small letters, into a plaque near the lobby of the tower that now bore their name. Grace's phone buzzed while the coffee was still too hot to drink. It was a message from Maya Brooks, a legal aid attorney Grace had funded through law school and had trusted with real cases ever since. One of the few people who knew exactly who Grace was and had learned, over the years, when to say so and when to let the work speak first. There's an emergency eviction hearing this morning. My client has receipts. The landlord says she never paid. Something is wrong and I don't know what yet. Could really use your eyes on this. Quietly, if you can. Grace read it twice. A woman who had already sent proof of payment was still standing to lose her home in a matter of hours. She typed back, "I'll be there," and set the phone down. She was already scheduled to inspect 2 floors of mechanical systems that morning. So she pulled her gray uniform off its hanger, instead of the jacket she wore to board meetings. She packed her worn leather folder, building reports, ownership documents, a program ledger, a short list of emergency contacts, and left before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. At Whitaker Civic Center, the lobby security line moved in its usual rhythm. A man in an expensive suit flashed a corporate badge and walked through without breaking stride. When Grace reached the front, the guard's tone changed. "Maintenance doesn't need courtroom floor access. he said, reaching for her bag. I have a work order for the 7th floor, Grace said, and I'm attending a public hearing afterward. He searched every pocket anyway, wanded her twice though it hadn't beeped, and asked twice why someone in her position needed to be near a courtroom. Grace answered evenly and let him finish. She had walked through this lobby 1,000 times in 1,000 different jackets, and she'd learned exactly how much attention a uniform bought you, and in which direction. Nobody had ever unzipped every pocket of the bag she carried to board meetings. Near the elevators hung a small brass plaque, Whitaker Civic Center. Grace looked at it the way she always did, remembering 2 people with calloused hands who'd had no idea their names would end up in brass. Outside courtroom 4, she found Maya waiting beside a woman and a boy. Denise Carter, mid-30s, clutched a canvas folder against her chest like it might be taken from her. Caleb, 8, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Are we going to lose the apartment?" he asked. "Will I still go to my school next week?" "We're going to find out what happened," Denise told him, crouching to his eye level, her voice steady even though her hands weren't. Maya introduced Grace only as someone who understood property records. No more than that, by mutual understanding. Denise opened her canvas folder without being asked. Rent receipts, bank statements, email confirmations, a printed letter from a rental assistance program, transaction numbers circled in pen. "Southgate says I missed 3 months," Denise said. "I have proof I paid every one of them." Maya lowered her voice. "Their internal ledger still shows the units unpaid. I don't understand how paperwork like this disappears." Grace studied the papers without comment. Southgate Residential Management. She recognized the name from complaints that had crossed her own housing program desk before. Vanished payments. Evictions that moved suspiciously fast. She said nothing about that yet. "Let's follow the records and see where they lead," she said. "One step at a time." Inside, a court employee eyed Grace's uniform. "Public seating isn't available to building staff during an active session," he said. "I'm not on shift right now," Grace said. "I have the same right to observe a public hearing as anyone else in this building." Maya backed her up, and the bailiff, a heavy-set man named Ruiz who looked like he'd rather be doing anything else, waved her through with a shrug. Grace took a seat several rows behind Denise. Judge Preston Harland took the bench, a man in his early 60s who ran his courtroom like a stopwatch, efficient, impatient, allergic to delay. He had a reputation, quietly discussed among legal aid attorneys, for treating poor litigants as inconveniences and young lawyers as children who needed correcting. He'd cleared more landlord-tenant cases in a morning than most judges managed in a week, and wore that number like a medal. As he sat, his secretary, Elaine Porter, set the morning's docket folder at his elbow and murmured something about the Southgate matter being straightforward, same as the others. Harland nodded without really listening. He noticed the gray uniform 3 rows back within the first minute. Not hostility yet, just a sense that the room wasn't arranged the way it should be. Charles Vance stood for Southgate Residential Management, a lead attorney, in a suit that fit too well for a landlord-tenant docket. He submitted a clean, printed ledger showing 3 months of missed rent under Denise Carter's name, and pushed, before Maya had even finished responding, for an immediate order of possession. No continuance, no review period, filed and signed by end of morning. "That's not true," Denise said, before Maya could stop her. "I paid every month." "Miss Carter, you'll have your turn," Harland said, not looking up. Maya presented the receipts and bank confirmations. Harland flipped through them for perhaps 10 seconds before setting them aside. "The landlord has submitted a sworn ledger," he said. "Unless counsel can authenticate these receipts against Southgate's own system and tie them to this tenant's account, the court has little basis to disturb it today." "Your Honor, that's exactly what a short continuance would let us do," Maya said. "Denied. This docket doesn't have room for open-ended fishing expeditions." Denise tried again. "If you just look at the assistance letter." "I said you'll have your turn," Harland said, cutting her off. At the defense table, Southgate's representatives sat with the calm of people who already knew how the morning would end. Vance glanced once toward the side door where Porter stood, and she gave the faintest nod back, the kind of gesture two people share when a routine is running exactly as planned. "Why is the cleaning woman sitting in my courtroom?" Harland asked, loud enough for the room to hear. "I'm attending a public hearing, Your Honor," Grace said. "The seat is public. I'm part of the public." Maya rose. "Your Honor, there's no basis to single out an observer." "Sit down, counsel," Harland said, and Maya did, jaw tight. A few minutes later, a legal assistant setting down a pitcher of water near Southgate's table knocked it over. Harland glanced at the mess, then at Grace, and something in his face settled into a decision. "Since you're dressed for it," he said, "clean that up." The room went quiet in a different way than before. Grace could have argued that it wasn't her job, that the request existed only to put her back in her place in front of an audience. Instead, she stood, walked to the spill, and knelt to wipe it, because making a scene over the water would have taken the room's attention away from the boy 3 rows ahead, waiting to hear if he'd have a bed that night. Kneeling that close to the defense table, she saw the edge of Southgate's filing near the table leg, a property identifier printed along the header, and beneath it, a string of transaction reference numbers. She didn't touch the paper. Years of reading property records told her something about the identifier was wrong. A valid county property identifier ran 11 characters. This one had 9. She finished wiping the floor at an unhurried pace, catching the first and last few digits of one transaction reference before the assistant slid the paper back under a folder. She returned to her seat, tore a page from the back of her folder, and wrote 2 lines. She caught Maya's eye and passed the note forward through Denise, who handed it along without a word. Maya read it and stood. "Your Honor, I've just been shown that the property identifier on Southgate's filing doesn't match county format. It's missing 2 characters. That kind of error can misroute or misclassify a payment. I'm asking for 5 minutes to verify it before this court rules." Vance turned halfway around, amused. "Is counsel now taking legal advice passed hand to hand from the maintenance staff?" "I'm asking the court to check a filing against a public record," Maya said. "That's not advice. That's 5 minutes." Harland didn't inquire, denied. "Your Honor," Grace said, because he'd turned to look at her when he said it, and a direct look in an open courtroom was not the same as volunteering unsolicited testimony. A child could lose his home over something that takes minutes to check. "You are becoming a distraction," Harland said. "Bailiff, escort her out." Ruiz hesitated, glancing between the judge and the woman he'd waved in 20 minutes earlier. "I'll comply with any lawful instruction," Grace said. "I'd only ask the court to preserve that filing before it leaves the room. Speak again and I will hold you in contempt." Grace didn't speak again, not yet. She sat back down, folder in her lap, and let the silence do what her voice couldn't in that moment. It was Denise who broke it, sliding a second document from her canvas folder with shaking hands. "I found this last night," she said. "It's from the Whitaker Community Housing Initiative. It shows 3 months of assistance sent straight to Southgate's account, back in the spring." Maya took the page, scanned it, and went still. Grace recognized the letterhead before she read a word. It was her own programs. The confirmation number proved the money had landed in Southgate's account. It had never once appeared on Denise's tenant ledger. "Your Honor, this raises a real possibility of payment diversion," Maya said. "The assistance program's own records show funds reaching the landlord that were never credited to my client." "Do you have definitive proof of fraud?" Harland asked. "I have proof the money arrived and proof it never showed up on the ledger. That gap needs investigation." "I'm not pausing a hearing for a gap," Harland said, though for the first time that morning his voice had lost some of its certainty. At the defense table, Southgate's calm cracked slightly. Vance leaned toward Martin Shaw, the company's regional director, and murmured something behind a raised hand. Neither of them looked back at Porter this time. Grace watched the exchange and, for a moment, hesitated before reaching for her phone. Once the deed came into this room, Nobody would hear anything else about her again. Not the folder, not the identifier, not the years of buildings she and Daniel had built floor by floor. They would only hear owner, and they would finally listen for exactly the reason they should never have needed to. She made the call anyway. A child's home mattered more than which reason got him heard. She slipped into the hallway and called Thomas Reed, the building's operations director. I need the access logs for Southgate's suite and their tenant payment routing summary pulled and preserved now, she said, and bring the deed, the ownership certification, and the courthouse lease. I want everything else, camera footage, vendor entries, preserved on the server but held. I don't want it walking into that room until it's been through the chief judge properly. You're sure? Thomas asked. Once any of this comes into a courtroom, people are going to know who you are. Only if it's what stops an unjust ruling, Grace said. Get me the logs and the deed. Everything else waits for the chief judge. She walked back inside as a building employee entered with a sealed envelope. Harland's patience, already thin, snapped further. Another interruption. What is this? Documents relevant to Miss Carter's case, Your Honor, Grace said. I warned you once. Speak again, and I'll have you arrested. Your Honor, Maya said quickly, I'm formally requesting the court review these records before ruling. Harland nodded once, sharply, for the bailiff to bring the envelope forward. Inside was a printed summary showing Denise's assistance payment reaching Southgate's master account and vanishing from her individual ledger. 3 days later, alongside an access log showing after-hours entries into Southgate's suite by court personnel with no listed reason to be there. Harland tried for a moment to keep the packet on his own bench rather than let Maya review it. It didn't prove he was involved in anything. It only made the room wonder why a judge would want to control evidence instead of reading it aloud. 3 attorneys stepped forward with the recorded deed, the LLC ownership certification, and the courthouse lease. Thomas Reed addressed her the way he addressed her everywhere else. Mrs. Whitaker, everything you asked for. The deed named Whitaker Civic Properties LLC as owner of the tower, Grace Whitaker as chair and controlling owner. Somewhere in the gallery, a phone camera turned toward the bench, then toward Grace. I want an emergency stay, Maya said. Preservation of every record connected to this, Judge Harland's recusal, and referral to the chief judge. You don't dictate the terms of my courtroom, Harland said, his voice rising for the first time. No, Your Honor, Grace said. But this is my building. The room went still in a different way than before. The way a room goes still when it's recalculating everything it just watched. Harland looked at the woman he'd ordered off the floor with a wet towel less than an hour earlier, and something in his expression cracked open. I don't answer to a landlord, he said, but the words came out thinner than he meant them to. You're right, Grace said. Owning this building doesn't make me a judge, and it never gave me authority over your rulings. It gave me lawful access to an access log and a payment record you were trying to keep out of this room. Those records are the reason this hearing can't continue without an investigation. Not my name on a deed. Within the hour, Chief Judge Eleanor Price arrived from an upper floor, already briefed by phone. She reviewed the identifier discrepancy, the payment record, and the access login under 10 minutes, entirely procedural, without a trace of theater. The eviction is stayed, she said. Judge Harland is recused from this matter pending a conflict review. All records concerning Southgate, Miss Porter, and related eviction filings are to be preserved effective immediately. Miss Porter's access to court systems is suspended pending investigation. Southgate is barred from altering or closing any tenant account referenced here. A formal evidentiary hearing will be scheduled to review the remaining preserved footage and logs under proper authentication. That hearing took place 2 days later, before Chief Judge Price, with counsel from both sides present, and the footage entered into the record under sworn chain of custody testimony from Thomas Reed. It showed Elaine Porter entering Southgate's suite after hours, 6 months earlier. Minutes later, Martin Shaw arrived. They spoke for close to 15 minutes. Papers changed hands, followed by a small drive passed from her palm into his. Access logs showed the same pattern repeating in the days before several other eviction hearings on Southgate's docket. Nobody in that hearing claimed the footage proved Harland himself had taken anything. It didn't need to. It showed enough to establish that his courtroom had a leak, and that the leak ran directly into the company trying to take a child's home. No one was declared guilty that day. The matter was referred to housing regulators, the Judicial Conduct Commission, and the District Attorney's Office, each to determine what the evidence actually proved. After the first hearing ended, Harland lingered near the bench, trying out an explanation before it had fully formed. "If I'd known who you were from the start." "You didn't need to know who I was," Grace said. "Every fact I gave you was true before anyone in this room knew I owned anything. You had receipts. You had a mismatched property number. You had a mother and a child and a request for 5 minutes. You didn't ignore an owner. You decided a worker wasn't worth hearing." She didn't wait for him to answer. She picked up her folder and walked out to find Denise and Caleb. Over the following months, investigators traced the shape of what Southgate had built. Emergency assistance payments meant for tenants had been routed into a holding account instead of individual ledgers. Southgate then filed non-payment claims against tenants whose rent had already been covered, collected late fees, evicted them, and re-leased the same units at higher rates. Diverted money moved through a handful of shell vendors that existed mostly on paper. Investigators eventually reviewed several hundred connected tenant files, reversing a number of wrongful evictions and arranging compensation for families who had already lost their homes. Martin Shaw and 2 Southgate executives were charged with fraud, theft, and falsifying business records. Elaine Porter faced charges once financial records confirmed payments tied to her access and the meetings on camera. Charles Vance was referred for professional discipline after an internal email surfaced, showing he'd received Denise's assistant's payment confirmation 2 days before filing the ledger that claimed she hadn't paid. Though the bar's investigation into how much else he'd known would take considerably longer than the hearing that started it. The Judicial Conduct Commission reviewed Harland's treatment of Grace, his repeated contempt threats, his refusal to pause for evidence that could be verified in minutes, and his failure to disclose his own secretary's ties to a company appearing regularly on his docket. Investigators found no proof he'd personally taken anything from Southgate. That didn't save him. He was suspended pending further review and, within the year, resigned rather than face a public hearing on the pattern the commission had assembled. Not because he owned nothing, but because he'd built a courtroom where evidence mattered less than who was allowed to speak in it. Denise Carter's eviction record was cleared. She and Caleb stayed in their apartment, now current on a ledger that matched reality, and Denise received restitution for the months Southgate had wrongly charged her. Within a year, she began working part-time at the new legal aid office, helping other families read a rent ledger and recognize a fraudulent notice before it reached a courtroom. Maya Brooks became lead counsel on a class action representing tenants swept up in Southgate's scheme. Work Grace funded through the Justice Fund without ever directing a single one of Maya's decisions, a boundary Grace kept even when Maya asked for her opinion. Whitaker Civic Center changed as a building, not just as a headline. Security footage went under independent, tamper-proof retention, no longer subject to being pulled by any single tenant, including the courts themselves. Frontline staff, regardless of title, got a clear channel to report misconduct without fear of dismissal. Court security personnel were retrained on the rights of public observers after an outside review. Found Grace's morning at the security line hadn't been an isolated incident. Housing assistance payments now generated a confirmation visible to both tenant and landlord the moment funds moved, closing the exact gap that had swallowed Denise's rent for 6 months. Any eviction filing tied to public assistance required a reconciled payment history before a hearing could even be scheduled, a rule that on its own kept several similar cases from ever reaching a judge's bench. The courts adopted a number of these standards through their own administrative process, Not because a landlord imposed them, but because the case had made the gap impossible to ignore. A year later, a new legal aid office opened on the ground floor, the Daniel and Grace Whitaker Housing Justice Center, offering free eviction defense, rent assistance, and payment verification for families who had nowhere else to turn. Grace walked through the lobby that morning in the same gray uniform, on her way to check a ventilation complaint on the 9th floor. A new security officer, hired after the old one had left, didn't recognize her as anything but a maintenance worker. He greeted her by the name on her badge and held the door without being asked. Near the elevators, an attorney in a rush dropped an armful of files. A young cleaning employee crouched to help her gather them. The attorney thanked her, and then, instead of walking off, asked her name. Grace watched the exchange for a moment and said nothing. She didn't need to. Inside the Justice Center, Maya stepped out beside Denise. Caleb was down the hall, backpack over one shoulder, arguing cheerfully with another kid about whose sneakers were better, no longer wondering each night whether he'd have a bed to sleep in. The deed had changed how a courtroom looked at Grace Whitaker. It never changed what she was worth. A woman in that same gray uniform, with no building to her name and no folder full of ownership papers, would have deserved exactly the same right to be heard, the same access to a public hearing, the same basic consideration as anyone else standing in that room. Judge Harland's failure was never that he mocked the owner of a 23-story building. His failure was believing that someone he'd already decided was just a maid could safely be dismissed. So here's the question worth sitting with. Should a judge who repeatedly threatens ordinary citizens for simply speaking up stay on the bench? And what responsibility belongs to the bailiffs, court staff, and supervising judges who watch that pattern continue and say nothing? Leave your answer below.